All right, so last time we were talking about the carbon cycle, and what did I ask you guys to do between last time and this time? Read the chapters, yes. What else did I ask you to do? Yep, yep, that also, but what else? My last instruction to you at the end of class on Monday. Asked you guys to look at the carbon cycle and do what with it? Pardon? Yeah, so we can think about the carbon cycle without humans on Earth, and we can think about the carbon cycle with humans on Earth. And so one way you can think about nutrient cycling is to think about inputs and outputs. So the major pool for carbon is up here in the atmosphere. But all of these arrows represent flows of carbon from one part of the ecosystem to another part of the ecosystem. And so we can ask ourselves, to what degree do organisms take carbon out of the atmosphere and incorporate it into plants and animals and things like this? And to what degree do they put carbon back into the atmosphere? So when we look at the main draw out of the atmosphere, there are 120 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon per year that are taken out of the atmosphere, removed from the atmosphere, in the form of photosynthesis. So this is plants doing their thing, capturing carbon and storing it in plant bodies, essentially. But then animals eat that, and we have respiration from plants equals about 60 times 10 to the 15 grams per year through respiration by plants, cellular respiration by plants. And then we see that there's about, this is from plants and animals. This is, for some reason, it shifted over. Plants and animals. And then there's 55 times 10 to the 15th. 55 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon per year that's put back in the atmosphere through soil respiration. Which basically means that every year the Earth and all the organisms that are on it should be storing about 5 picograms of carbon a year, 5 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon per year, and that's all stored down in soil. So one measure of kind of ecosystem health is how much carbon is getting stored in the soil. And so we have a carbon cycle that, without humans messing with it at all, takes a lot of the carbon that is released through decomposition and returns it to the atmosphere, but takes some of that and stores it down in the soil carbon compartment, where it just stays there. And it stays there for long periods of time, can eventually get turned into things like coal and oil and natural gas and things like this through the process of long-term geological consolidation of soil into rock. So this represents what we think of as net storage, and it's being stored in soils. And so the carbon cycle, without human beings doing the things that human beings are doing, we would be taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it in soil. But the kinds of things that humans do We still have 120 being taken out of the atmosphere via photosynthesis. We still have 60 being added back through cellular respiration of above ground organisms, and 55 being added back due to soil respiration, which gives us 5 times 10 to the 15th storage, storage in soil. But then humans enter the equation and we start burning fossil fuels. Well, fossil fuels are just the prior photosynthetic activity of plants that have been pressurized and heated and converted into coal, oil, peat, things like this. And we dig that stuff up because we're clever, and we burn that to heat our homes, run our lights, power our computers, et cetera, et cetera. But in the process of doing that, we add back 5.3 times 10 to the 15 grams of carbon per year back to the atmosphere. So now we've shifted this balance from a cycle that stores carbon in soil to a cycle that exports carbon back to the atmosphere. But that's not the only thing that we do. We also do things like converting land from forest to agricultural fields. When you convert a forest to agriculture, you basically take all the stored carbon that is stored in those trees, you burn that off, which sends carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But the other thing that does is it prevents those trees from capturing any carbon in the future. And so you have this initial pulse of carbon going into the atmosphere, and then you've reduced the ability of that ecosystem to absorb carbon in the future because those trees are no longer there. They've been replaced by corn and soybeans and whatever else. That ends up being 3.8 times 10 to the 15 grams of carbon per year. So now we're up to 4.1 times 10 to the 15 grams of carbon per year. What else is there in all of this? Yeah, I think that's it. So you can create a balance equation for any nutrient cycle. This happens to be what the picture is for carbon. So we take a natural carbon cycle before humans started messing with it that stores carbon, and human activity has converted that into a carbon cycle that exports carbon to the atmosphere. And so if you look at the long-term history of carbon dioxide levels, as long as people have been measuring them, what you see is that since the late 50s, we have been increasing the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. This is data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. One thing you should notice about this figure is that it just steadily goes up. What other things can you notice about this figure? These are monthly averages. So each dot in this timeline represents a month. What do you notice about the line? It's constantly going up and down, even as it inexorably goes up over time. What do you think causes that yearly fluctuation in the amount of carbon that is in the atmosphere? Okay, so seasonality. So how would seasonality influence the amount of carbon dioxide that is in the atmosphere? We're coming into fall right now here in the northern hemisphere. What's happening to our trees? They're losing their leaves. When you lose your leaves, you lose your ability to do what? You lose your ability to do photosynthesis. Are you still doing cellular respiration as a tree? You're still alive as a tree. The tree doesn't die in the winter and then come back to life in the spring. It's still alive. If you're alive, you're doing cellular respiration. So during the winter, trees lose their leaves. They're no longer absorbing carbon dioxide because they're not doing photosynthesis. but they continue to do cellular respiration, and in the process of continuing to do cellular respiration, they let off carbon dioxide. So in winter, wherever you're at on the face of the earth, you're going to be pumping more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere because plants are not taking up carbon dioxide while they're still managing to produce it because they're undergoing cellular respiration. But we have winter in the northern hemisphere, but they also have winter in the southern hemisphere. Why don't those two things balance one another such that it doesn't fluctuate seasonally? What do you know about the distribution of land masses in the world? Is there more land in the north than in the south? Is there more land in the south than in the north, or is there equal amounts of land in both places? There is a lot more land in the north. And so the reason that this carbon figure fluctuates is that carbon levels in the atmosphere peak during the northern hemisphere winter. As the trees green up and start doing photosynthesis again, they start absorbing more carbon dioxide, such that they're absorbing more carbon dioxide than they're producing, which makes the carbon levels in the atmosphere go down. As fall comes on, they begin to lose their leaves. They stop doing photosynthesis. They're now producing more carbon dioxide than they're taking in. And the reason that this fluctuates this way is because so much more of the forests are found in the northern hemisphere than in the southern hemisphere. So it's the northern hemisphere winter that kind of dominates this cycling. So we have this increase in carbon dioxide level. This is the thing that concerns scientists where global warming is concerned, because carbon dioxide is one of the so-called greenhouse gases. And it's one of the greenhouse gases that we produce the most of. There are other greenhouse gases, methane and things like this, but even water vapor is considered to be a greenhouse gas. But this is one of the big ones, and it's one of the ones that we kind of have the most control over as well. So when we think about climate change, climates are big, complicated systems that require a lot of different inputs that affect climate. And so climate ends up being very difficult to model, but I can maybe make a little demonstration. I have a key fob. Who's good at catching and throwing? Yeah, catch this. I'm going to throw it at you. It's my key fob to my car, so don't let it fall because I don't want it to break. No pressure. You got it. Throw it back to me. We're throwing this back and forth. What enables us to do this effectively? See, he reached out. He knew exactly where it was going to be, right? I can throw it directly at him, but I don't have to. I can throw it off to the side and he'll still catch it because he knows where it's going. Why? Put a little spin on that one. Why can he catch it and I can catch it? What is it about a fob? It's irregularly shaped, but what is it also? Even though it's irregularly shaped, it's pretty small, but it's got some heft to it. Got some heft to it, right? It's smooth. It has good aerodynamics for an irregularly shaped object. And humans basically are really good at calculating the trajectory of objects in our head. We don't do it formally, we do it instinctively, but a fob flying through the air is a relatively simple mathematical equation to work out. As a result, we can predict where it's going to go in our heads, and we can also predict how we need to throw it. I can fling it at him really hard and low. Nice catch. Or I can lob it to him, and either way, I change how I throw it based on kind of what my trajectory is going to be. If I want to throw it flat, I throw it fast. If I want to throw it slow, I have to lob it because I know that because it's traveling slower, it needs to gain more. Sorry, I wasn't looking at you there. I have to lob it because I know that the decreased speed makes it have to stay in the air longer in order to make it there. Nice lob. That's a model. It's a mathematical model of the motion of this thing as it travels through the air. And it's an easy mathematical model because the shape is simple. It's oblong and everything, but all of the surfaces are smooth, such that things like friction, drag, and stuff like that doesn't really affect the fob as it goes through the air. 2 erasers, here you go. Sorry, didn't mean to make you drop your stuff. Whoa, where'd that go? 2 erasers. Who else wants to play? Julia, you want to play? No. All right, let's go. Okay, when I throw it to you, I spin it. When you throw it to me, you haven't been spinning it, and as a result, it has a little tougher of a trajectory. Me spinning it, the spinning action overcomes the added drag. So this is an eraser now. When I throw it to you flat, it's a little less predictable than when I throw it to you spinning, because the spinning action overcomes the drag of the thing flying through the air. But this has some heft. This is a felt eraser, whereas this is some weird styrofoam eraser. What do you notice about the styrofoam eraser? It's less predictable, isn't it? Well, why? Well, because it has this furry side that picks up a lot of drag, and there's not a lot of weight to overcome that drag, that friction as it goes through the air. As a result, it doesn't fly predictably. It goes off in weird directions as drag takes it different directions. To the point that it's very hard to predict where this thing is going to land when you throw it. As a result, we're worse at throwing erasers at people than we are at throwing footballs or basketballs or key fobs at people, because the physics of it is more complicated. Now, as I throw this, it still lands in the vicinity of where I'm throwing it. It's not always perfect, but it lands in the vicinity of where I'm throwing it. And so, even though it's more complicated, it's not like I'm throwing it one direction and it ends up on the other side of the room. It's going in the direction that I'm throwing it. It's just a little less predictable. And this is exactly what happens when we go to model complex systems. An eraser, a dry eraser made out of styrofoam and whatever this fuzzy stuff is a more complicated thing to model than a key fob, because you have to consider more things about it. The irregular shape, the weight, the friction as it goes through the air, et cetera, et cetera. Key fob is easier because it has more weight, it's smooth, it glides through the air easily because it's smooth, partly. Well, the same thing is true of climate modeling. Climate models are complex models, but they're not intractable. It's just that there are a lot more variables that you have to consider in order to model climate effectively. And so what scientists generally do when they're modeling complex systems is they sit around and they think about all of the things that might influence the model. How much CO2 is in the air, how much methane, how much water, what the sun is doing. The sun varies in its solar output over time. Whether or not we have volcanoes. Volcanoes put ash up in the atmosphere that shades the earth to a certain degree for 1 or 2 years after the volcano erupts. If it's a really big eruption, that can actually lower global temperatures. We throw all this stuff into a model, and it's all stuff that we think is important in predicting what climate is going to do. And then we test that by going and finding those measurements back in the past. And we say, okay, we know what these measurements are in the past. We also know what the record of temperature was in the past. How well do these parameters, these variables that we measure, how well do they predict what happened in the past? And we can truth that model against what happened in the past. And if it describes well what happened in the past, it should describe well what's going to happen in the future. As we go through that ground truthing phase of model building, we discover that some things are more important than other things. Some variables are more important than other variables. We throw out the unimportant variables or we downweight them. And some variables behave in ways that we didn't expect them to behave. And so we tweak the model until we have good agreement of the model output with the actual record of whatever it is that we're trying to model. Once we have developed a model that does a good job of showing us what was in the past, we can then use that model to predict what's going to happen in the future under certain assumptions. And so there's a group called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Every 8 years or so, they put out a report. They're working on a new report now. And what they've done is they've basically built a model that pretty effectively predicts what the past climate has been doing, and they then project it into the future where they put all of the factors into the model and try and match the data versus only the natural factors in the model. And what you see is that temperature is increasing, and it fluctuates from year to year. Temperature is increasing, but it's increasing in a way that's indicative of the fact that you have to include both natural factors and human factors in the model versus natural factors where you would actually just see climate staying the same. What do you suspect these dips are that we see periodically? There's a dip in climate here. There's a dip in climate here, a dip in climate here, a dip in climate here. What's driving these decreases, these short-term decreases in global temperature? I mentioned it earlier. What happens that has the ability to shade out the entire surface of the Earth? It's happening in Spain right now. Yeah, an eruption, a volcanic eruption. The La Paloma eruption in Spain is going on right now. So volcanic eruptions have the ability to throw a bunch of dust up in the atmosphere. That dust basically has a shading effect on the Earth, and that's what accounts for these periodic dips in temperature, is volcanic eruptions that were of a magnitude big enough that they can affect global climate. When people think about climate solutions, one of the things that has been put forth is actually putting stuff up into the upper atmosphere, basically putting dust up in the upper atmosphere that will basically absorb and reflect sunlight before it gets low enough in the atmosphere that it contributes to warming. These are called geoengineering ideas. So the science on climate change is fairly well established. And it's fairly well established that human activities are what is driving climate change. And the question then is what, if anything, we're going to do about it. So, questions about the carbon cycle. It's one of the simplest of all of the cycles. The next one, which is super important for farming, is nitrogen. And it is by far the most complicated of the cycles. And the reason that it's complicated is because the fluxes that are in the nitrogen cycle are oftentimes transformations, and there are a bunch of different transformations, and so it's complicated. The reason that I want you to know about the nitrogen cycle is that corn, in particular, is a nitrogen-loving plant. It takes a lot of nitrogen to farm corn. Soybeans is a plant that actually takes nitrogen out of the atmosphere and puts it into soils. And so whenever we think about crop rotation by farmers with crops like corn and crops like soybean, corn is drawing nitrogen out of the soil as you grow it and harvest it, whereas soybeans are putting nitrogen back into the soil as you grow it. And so it's a more complicated cycle, but it's really important for agriculture. So strap on your brains, because this is going to be a little rough. Just telling you. It's going to be a little rough. Before we do that, any questions about carbon? Okay, first thing you need to know about nitrogen is that nitrogen is put together with 3 bonds. Carbon is bonded to one another with generally only 2 bonds, especially carbon in the form of glucose and carbon in the form of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide has a double bond, but glucose has a single bond. Nitrogen is held together with 3 bonds. Because it is held together with 3 bonds, it's much harder to split those 2 nitrogen atoms apart because they're held together in 3 spots, essentially. This makes up the vast majority of the gas that is in the atmosphere. And because it's bonded together by 3 bonds, not very many organisms can take advantage of the nitrogen that is in the atmosphere because it's too tightly bound to itself. So, there are a group of organisms that have the ability to take atmospheric nitrogen in the form of N2, this triply bonded molecule of 2 nitrogen atoms, and it has the ability to break it apart, add hydrogens to it to create ammonia. And this is the first step in making nitrogen available to plants. And so, do you guys know what kind of organisms are capable of doing this? Anybody? This is accomplished by what we call nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These are bacteria that occur in the soil. So there's a lot of bacteria in the soil, lots of different types of bacteria in the soil. One subset of the bacteria are these bacteria that are capable of fixing nitrogen. And some of these are free living in the soil. But a lot of these bacteria actually live in association with the roots of plants. So plants like soybeans in the family Fabaceae, the so-called legumes, these are the bean-producing plants. So whenever you're eating beans, you're eating a member of the family Fabaceae. These bacteria have the ability to take nitrogen, split it, add hydrogen to it, and make it available to plants. That's pretty much it for that. This requires an enzyme. Because the bonds holding the 2 nitrogen atoms together are so strong, it takes a lot of energy in order to break them. And the way bacteria do this, the way that they accomplish this, is by using enzymes. What's one way of describing what an enzyme does, or how an enzyme acts? It reduces what? Yeah, Aiden. Okay, enzymes reduce the amount of energy that is required to get a reaction to go to completion. So anytime you have 2 molecules or 2 atoms that are bound together tightly, that require a lot of energy, the easiest way to get those things to break apart is to accomplish that using an enzyme. So there's an enzyme called nitrogenase. This enzyme nitrogenase is the enzyme that catalyzes nitrogen fixation because it requires a lot of energy. It requires 10 grams of glucose to fix 1 gram of nitrogen. So that's a huge amount of energy to put into this process, and nitrogenase helps facilitate this. Yeah?
So nitrogenase splits it apart or adds it?
I'm sorry, repeat the question?
You said nitrogenase helps split the atom apart.
Help split the atom apart. Yeah, sorry. Once it's apart, those free electrons are free to bond with hydrogen. You'll notice that that in this equation, you basically are taking nitrogen and you're creating two molecules that have three hydrogens attached to them. So if you think about nitrogen as having two electrons that are unpaired and three that are available for bonding, what it does is it sticks a hydrogen on each one of those free electrons once nitrogen is free of itself. So a hydrogen will go here, a hydrogen will go here, a hydrogen will go here for this nitrogen, hydrogen here, here, and here for this nitrogen, and that's where you get the two molecules of ammonia. So this is what the roots of a legume look like. You can see the roots themselves here, but then you can see these balls that are attached to the roots. These are outgrowths of the roots that have grown out and grown around the rhizobium, these bacteria that associate themselves with the roots of plants. And over time, the plant will send out this part of its roots will surround these things and will basically form a vegetative structure of the root that basically encapsulates the bacteria that are going to then do the fixing of the nitrogen, these nitrogen fixing bacteria. And so this is a type of symbiosis. Symbiosis just refers to any situation in biology where two organisms live in close association with one another. And there are lots of different symbioses. This is a mutualistic symbiosis. And so in this symbiosis, what do you think the plant is getting out of the deal? In this case, we have plants that are living in close association with these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So what does the plant get out of the deal? They get nitrogen. They get a nitrogen available to them that they don't have to spend a bunch of energy fixing. What do the bacteria get? Or are bacteria just freeloaders? Or is the plant just a freeloader, getting the nitrogen from the bacterium, but the bacterium getting nothing in return? What does a plant produce that a bacterium might need?
What's the reason for the plant job?
Plant gets nitrogen from the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. What might the bacterium get from the plant? Something that plants are very good at producing. They fix carbon dioxide and turn it into what? Nope, that's a byproduct. What's the main thing that they're trying to create? Glucose. What does glucose store? It's a storage form of what? Why do animals eat plants? Why do plants do photosynthesis? Well, they're all looking for glucose, but why glucose? Energy. This is the long-term storage form of energy. And so the plants are getting nitrogen from the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and the plants are giving the bacteria glucose, which they, of course, need to survive. And so this is the nature of the mutualism. A mutualism is a situation where two organisms are living in close association with one another, and both of them benefit from that interaction. In the case of the bacteria, they get glucose, the energy that they need to survive, and what they give up for that is they give up oxygen, which the plant then needs to survive and thrive. So, when we think about nitrogen inputs to an ecosystem, we have to think about this nitrogen that is in the atmosphere, and we have to think about how that nitrogen in the atmosphere gets into the terrestrial ecosystem. Well, humans do this a lot by cultivating nitrogen-fixing crops. We also do a bunch of nitrogen fixation by using fossil fuels. And so there's nitrogen in fossil fuels, and we use nitrogen that is in fossil fuels to create nitrogen that is available to plants. But then there's also this idea of industrial fixation by the Haber-Bosch process. So in the chapter about corn, this is chapter 2 of the omnivore's dilemma, Michael Pollan talks about this guy named Fritz Hopper who created a mechanism by which you can get atmospheric nitrogen into a form that is usable by plants by just doing a chemical reaction in the lab. Yeah, question. Oh my, what happened there? That's weird. Why do things just change without me even touching my computer? If only I could. So Fritz Hopper is a guy that Michael Pollan talks about in his book. In 1897, he invented a process known as the Haber-Bosch process, which takes atmospheric nitrogen and converts it into ammonium nitrate. And so when you see these big white gas cylinders sitting in farm fields at the beginning of the spring, those big white canisters are filled with ammonium nitrate. And that ammonium nitrate is going to be used by farmers. They actually put it attached to a farm implement that has these tubes that stick down into the ground, and they basically inject that into the ground to add that nitrogen back into the soil to basically get their corn to grow. You don't need to fertilize soybeans with nitrogen fertilizers because they're capable of producing their own nitrogen, and that's all that they really need. And so you don't have to do that with nitrogen-fixing organisms. We're back. What else can you use ammonium nitrate for? You guys familiar? You guys weren't born yet. You guys ever hear of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City? What happened there, Aiden?
Timothy van fertilizer.
He did. He got some fertilizer from I think it was his uncle in Ohio, a corn and soybean farmer, put it in a van. The fertilizer was just ammonium nitrate, the ammonium nitrate that you see sitting around in farmers' fields in the spring, mixed it with diesel, created a fertilizer bomb, and detonated it in front of a federal building in downtown Oklahoma City, killed a bunch of people, and destroyed the building. There's now a memorial site there commemorating this really pretty terrible event in American history, although it was one of the worst things that had happened at the time, and so many worse things have happened since then. But it was a fertilizer bomb. So the other thing that ammonium nitrate can be used for is for making munitions. Ammonium nitrate is one of the things that goes into making gunpowder. It can be used to blow up buildings if you're a low-tech domestic terrorist. And so another purpose for ammonium nitrate is not just fertilizer, but it is actually munitions. Fritz Hopper actually got the Nobel Prize in chemistry as a result of inventing this process, in spite of the fact that not only was his invention used to increase agricultural productivity, it was also one of the main drivers of World War I and World War II, because suddenly you could, rather than mining ammonium nitrate out of geological deposits, you could just create it from the nitrogen floating around in the atmosphere. And so it made munitions much easier to produce. So humans increase nitrogen inputs into terrestrial ecosystems, but then there are also natural ways in which atmospheric deposition occurs. Lightning, when you get a lightning strike, there's enough energy in the lightning that it actually will break apart the molecules of nitrogen in the air. As soon as they're broken apart, they intermingle with water. That water provides the hydrogens that attach to those open electrons available for bonding in nitrogen, and so you can get fixation through high energy events in the atmosphere. So that's one transformation. So when we think of this model that we have where the atmosphere is up here and plants are here, plant roots, this is plant shoots above ground, plant roots below ground. Nitrogen from the atmosphere goes to plant roots through the action of nitrogen-fixing bacteria to become available to plants in the form of ammonia and in the form of nitrate. And so this process is called nitrogen fixation, and it's responsible for a big chunk of the input of nitrogen into terrestrial ecosystems. Once it's there, it's used by the plant, but eventually the plant dies, and so nitrogen goes from live organic matter to dead organic matter, but it doesn't change form. Whatever form that nitrogen was in plants, it's still in that form in the dead organic matter that is going into soils. What are the ways in which we see nitrogen in organisms? What kinds of biological macromolecules do we see nitrogen in? If you're a vegetarian or a vegan, you eat a lot of beans because you need a lot of what? Because you're not getting this from other things like beeves and fish. You need a lot of protein. And so one of the things about beans, because those are from nitrogen-fixing plants, those beans are generally high in protein. So we see nitrogen in protein. What other class of compounds do we see nitrogen in? So our choices are carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Where do we find nitrogenous bases? In nucleic acids. So when a plant dies, it's now dead organic matter rather than living organic matter, but all of that nitrogen is tied up in proteins and nucleic acids. And then once that starts to get broken down, as decomposers work on that, it becomes dissolved organic nitrogen, which is just nitrogen in various forms floating around in the soil. And once it's dissolved in the soil, it can go all kinds of places. It can be picked up bacteria. These bacteria can use it for their own metabolism, and they will basically turn it back into nitrogen gas that goes back into the atmosphere. But a lot of this nitrogen gets just leached out of the soil. Leaching is the process by which water, as it flows through soil, it will grab onto molecules because water has a slight charge to it, and so it will latch onto other charged molecules and basically drag them through the soil down to bedrock. Once the water hits bedrock, it flows laterally and eventually it gets into a stream. And so the water flowing through soils will pick up a lot of the nutrients, picks up nitrogen, picks up phosphorus, and just basically removes it from the ecosystem by translocating it from the soil into streams and lakes. But then the other thing that happens is there are bacteria and fungi that decompose the organic matter, and this decomposition is super important because, once again, it frees up that nitrogen, makes that nitrogen available to plant roots to be absorbed again. And so, all right. All right, I have no idea why this is doing this. Okay, we're back, strangely. So these decomposers break down the organic matter so that that nitrogen is then available to plants. Again, decomposition is affected by lots of things. The warmer it is, the faster things decompose. The moister it is, generally the faster things decompose. The quality of the plant matter that's being decomposed actually affects it, because in some cases there is a lot of carbon relative to very little nitrogen. Because organisms have to go through a lot of carbon to get to the very little nitrogen that is there, it's less likely to want to feed on that material, rather than when there's a little carbon relative to a lot of nitrogen. And so carbon-nitrogen ratios, if there's a really high carbon-nitrogen ratio, decomposers tend to avoid those food sources. If there's a low carbon to nitrogen ratio, there's a lot of nitrogen relative to the amount of carbon, they tend to go for those things most often. And so there are lots of things that influence rate of decomposition. Do you guys watch crime procedurals at all? Crime shows on TV? Oh, really? Okay. Well, if you've ever seen any crime show, a movie or a TV show, whenever you have a body that is decomposing, there's a window of time when you can kind of get a time of death based on the body temperature of the body and things like this. But out beyond a certain time period, you can't rely on those things anymore, and you begin to rely on the presence or absence of decomposers. What kinds of bugs are hanging out in the corpse of the individual who has died? And then beyond that, you can basically pay attention to kind of the stages of decomposition that have been happening. But all of these methods of dating the time in which a person was killed before they were dumped, if you're at a body dump, all of those things are calibrated by the temperature that that body has experienced, because everything happens under faster conditions than in colder conditions. Colder conditions slow down the rates of all of these decomposing organisms. So if you're ever looking to get rid of a body, do it in the summertime when rates of decomposition will be quick, rather than dumping it in the winter when it's going to decompose much more slowly. Once again, Ecology of Food providing practical advice to you on an almost daily basis. All right, so those are the kinds of things that affect rates of decomposition. So there are a bunch of other transformations. One of them is ammonification. And what it does is it takes dead organic nitrogen and converts it to ammonium. And this happens generally in soil. This is once again done by bacteria. And once again, it is influenced by the availability of the dead organic nitrogen or dissolved organic nitrogen. The dissolved organic nitrogen is a reactant, and so this equation can only be gone through at a rate that is limited by the supply of nitrogen. Also, the carbon-nitrogen ratio of that nitrogen is going to be important. And then the same things that we've already talked about, because bacteria are doing this. Bacteria are heavily influenced by temperature in terms of how quickly they can do things physiologically. Nitrification is also driven by bacteria. Basically, it takes the ammonium that was the result of ammonification, and it converts it to nitrate. And nitrate, once again, is a form of nitrogen that is very available to plants. Plants can absorb nitrate in this form very easily. Yes?
For me, like, non-organic, like, get an equation on a test, but
No, I'm going to bust this down for you in ways that make it easy to understand at the end of this. The things that you mainly need to concentrate on is what you start with and what you end with. All the stuff in between is just if you're curious about it. And then nitrification, so nitrification, once again, it's done by bacteria. It starts with ammonia, it ends with nitrate. The kinds of organisms that do this are specific types of bacteria. It's not the same bacteria that fix nitrogen, it's a different group of bacteria. It requires oxygen in order to proceed. Some things are aerobic, meaning that they require oxygen. Other things are anaerobic, which means they don't require oxygen. This is one of the processes that requires oxygen. And once again, it's limited by the availability of your starting material there. And then assimilation is the process by which these plants pick up nitrate and ammonia and amino acids from the soil. So plants in prairies have really deep root structures, and what you have in soils is a race between plants and water. Water flowing through the soil picks up nitrogen, wants to carry it out of the soil and into streams. Plants have to capture that nitrogen before the water leaches it all out. And so one of the ways that they do this, the plants do this, is they have these structures that allow them to absorb nitrogen and water from a large area. And so plants in nitrogen-poor soils will generally have very extensive root systems that allow them to capture as much nitrogen as possible. So another adaptation that plants have for this is they have associations with fungi. And these fungi basically grow into the root, but they also send out their mycelia. Mycelia are these thin filaments that fungi make, and these filaments go throughout the soil. And what can happen with a plant is the plant has its root system that gives itself access to a certain volume of soil, but then if it is associated with these fungi grow much further out into the soil than the plant roots do. The fungi pick up nitrogen and phosphorus. They bring that to the plant roots. They transfer it to the plant roots. The plant then gets nitrogen and phosphorus. And of course, what do they give the fungi in return? Fungi are bringing them nutrients. So the plant gives the fungi gives them glucose, it gives them energy. And so once again, this is another one of those symbiotic relationships that is involved in nutrient cycling. So here you can see the roots of the plant, but the roots of the plant end about right here. All this gray area out here are fungal hyphae, fungal mycelia going out into the soil, drastically increasing the amount of soil volume that is available to the roots of this plant. That is not root, but actually fungi. So, this just basically shows you, here's the root hairs, and then the fungal mycelia go out further into the root. They pick up phosphorus, they pick up nitrogen, they pick up water in many cases as well. They transfer it back to the root, and the root leaks root exudates, so fluid actually leaks out of the roots. When the fluid leaks out of the roots, these fungi pick it up and get the things that the fungi need to live, which is mainly sugars, is the main thing that is coming out in these root exudates that fungi pick up. And then denitrification is the process by which we take nitrate, which is available to plants. Bacteria, once again, convert it into atmospheric nitrogen that goes back into the atmosphere. This is a process that doesn't require oxygen, and it depends on all the things that we've talked about before, the availability of the starting material, and things like temperature. The other thing that happens is when you burn plants, you release a lot of nitrogen to the atmosphere. And so anytime you burn a plant, it's going to take ammonia, it's going to convert it into ammonium and convert it into ammonia and blow it off to the atmosphere. And this happens at relatively low temperatures. We've already talked about leaching. Nitrate is a negatively charged ion, and when it connects with water, water will latch onto it, and water will pull it out of soil. So, you could draw a model of nitrogen flow for nitrogen just like you can draw one for carbon, but it's a lot to keep track of. So I oftentimes find when I have complicated information like this to put it in a table. And so we have a series of processes that we need to keep track of. In these processes, there are organisms that accomplish the process. We have starting materials. These are sometimes in chemistry, in chemistry they're referred to as the reactants. And then there are the products of the process. And we can also think of where they occur, as well as who does them. So the first of these is nitrogen fixation. Who does nitrogen fixation? Who does nitrogen fixation? Yeah, bacteria. So in-fixing bacteria, nitrogen-fixing bacteria. What do we start with? What's the molecule that we begin with? Start with atmospheric nitrogen. Two nitrogen molecules bonded to one another. You write it either way. What do we end up with? Ammonia. Where does this occur? Some of these nitrogen-fixing bacteria are free-living, but some of these live where? Yep, so the free-living ones will live in the soil, but then we also have ones that live where? Yep, in the roots of legumes. What's the next process? Death and decomposition. Well, we start with whatever we had before, which is mainly ammonia, amino acids, and nucleic acids. Oh, that's the organisms. No organisms are involved with this. This is just stuff dying, organisms dying. We start with things like ammonia, ammonium, amino acids, and nucleic acids, and we end up with the same things. And this is, of course, happening on the surface of soil and down in soil. That's one of the least important things. Ammonification Starts with dissolved. Starts with dissolved organic nitrogen. And ends with ammonium. It's positively charged ion. This occurs mainly down in the soil, and this is accomplished by bacteria and other decomposers. Nitrification basically takes this ammonia and converts it into, oh, keep putting it in the wrong category, and converts it into nitrate. Now remember that nitrate is the most usable form of nitrogen for plants. This once again occurs primarily in soil, and it's done by nitrifying bacteria. Now once you have nitrate available to you, that allows plants to assimilate that nitrogen. So assimilation would be the next one that you might think of. This basically takes NO3 and it is absorbed by plants. So it's still in the form of nitrate. So it's a flux, but it doesn't involve a transformation. It's still in the same form that it was before. Assimilation is done by plants, basically absorbing nitrate through the roots. Of course, this occurs in the soil. And then the last of these things is denitrification, which takes nitrate and converts it back to N2. This is once again done in the soil. It's done by bacteria and it is denitrification. So one of the nice things about putting it in a table like this is we start with something in the atmosphere, we convert it into ammonia. That ammonia is then converted into ammonium. Ammonium is then converted into nitrate. Nitrate is picked up by plants. Whatever nitrate is not picked up by plants gets converted back into atmospheric nitrogen and returned to the atmosphere. So with this table, you then have all of the processes that you need to worry about. You know where they occur. You could build the same kind of model that we built for carbon for a nitrogen cycle. Now, is this everything you need to know? No. What helps plants assimilate nitrate from the soil? Well, they have these interactions with mycorrhizal fungi that send their mycelia out into the soil, gather up nitrogen from a much greater volume of soil, and get it to the plant roots. Is this everything you need to know about nitrogen fixation? No. You need to remember that the nitrogen-fixing bacteria form this mutualistic association with the roots of plants. The plants give up sugar in return for the bacteria fixing nitrogen that is then absorbed by the plants, et cetera, et cetera. This doesn't tell you everything that you know, but it helps you keep things straight in your head, hopefully. This is by far the most complicated of all of the nutrient cycles, and it's the last one that we will do. Friday, we will talk about the chapters that I asked you to read in the Omnivore's Dilemma, beginning with the chapter on corn, and you can feel free to take a picture of this board if you find that that would help you. You can take pictures of anything in this class, actually. This is a particularly useful picture. Questions? I will get out of your way.
What were the chapters for